Hello guys, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Mary, and today I am excited to bring to you the React testing crash course. So this is a Netflix clone which I built recently. We are going to start testing it from this login page, which is the very first page a user gets to when they visit the application. So we'll be testing what the user sees when they visit this page, the text that they see, the buttons that they see, the input elements that they see, and what happens when they click on the button, what happens when they enter input into the input element, what happens when they click on anything on the page. I decided to make this tutorial as beginner friendly as possible, so feel free to skip around if you already understand the basics. Now going back to the tools that we are going to be using. The first one is react.dev, which is what I used in building the application. Now if you've never used React before, you can find it here on this website react.dev. Just click on learn React and follow the steps to learn how to build an application with React. React testing library is a library that is built off Jest. So if we go to jestjs.io, which let me see, I'm just going to open it here, jestjs.io. Yeah, so it says Jest is a delightful JavaScript testing framework with a focus on simplicity. So I love the word simplicity because that is actually what you experience when you're testing your applications with Jest. And then you can use it to test not just front-end applications, but also back-end applications. The next tool is the React testing library, which you can find here. Now, it's important to note that if you created your React application using the Create React app, then you do not need to install the React testing library because it comes installed by default. But if you don't have it already, then you have to just run this command. If you're using yarn, don't forget to use the yarn command to install the library. Moving on, I decided to divide this course into two. So I decided to make the part one testing for visibility. For the part two, we'll be talking about functionality, which is what happens when your users actually interact with your application. Now, for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to be assuming that you already know how to build a React application. I have an app already set up here. I'm going to be dropping the link to the GitHub repository in the description below. So first, I'm going to give you a tour of what the application looks like, what the code base looks like actually. So the first place I want to take you to is the package.json. Here you will notice that I already have the React testing library installed. If you do not have these three dependencies, then you have to go back to the React testing library link I shared earlier and make sure you install it. Next, we are going to have the test script, which is this line 24, and this is what we'll be using to test our application just by running npm run test. Next up, I'll be introducing you to the entry point to my application, which is the index.js. The application makes use of React Redux, and that is why we have the provider wrapper here. We also have the Redux store, and we have the React browser router, which we renamed as router here. And then we have our application here. So going into the app.js, this is where we are making the decision of what particular endpoints the user goes to when they click on any of the links in our nav bar. Down here we have the /login part, which renders the login component. So we'll just go to the login component, which is in screen. This login screen is what we have in the application when the user visits the login page. And if the user clicks on the sign in button, we want to set the sign in state to be true. When the sign in state is true, we want to render the sign up screen. If the sign-in state is false, then the user sees all these shenanigans, which we'll be testing for in this tutorial. The sign up screen is somewhere down here as well. This is what contains the page which I showed earlier that has the email address and password input element. So we're going to be testing all these elements and be sure that they are working as expected. There is one more file which I would like to show you, this setup test.js. Also make sure that you have this file with this line of code in it. So we'll be opening our terminal and we are going to start by running our test to see what we have. So when we run npm run test, what happens is that the jest library that we are using will check through our code base to see if there is any file that is named with the extension .test.js. Whatever file it finds with that extension, it's going to run it and run the test cases in it. So we'll be opening this file. You can actually see the file path from here. So we'll be opening this file, which is in the source folder. You can also get to the file just by using command and clicking on this link here in the terminal. So this is the first test file we have, which most of the time comes by default when you use the create react app. If yours does not have this provider component or wrapper, just don't worry about it. We are using this because we are making use of React Redux. So we have the store here, which we have imported from our Redux store in this index.js file. Now the reason why we're wrapping this application in the provider is because we actually wrapped it in the provider from the app.js file. Oh no, not from the app.js file, it's inside the index.js file here. And whatever application or whatever component you are testing in React that makes use of Redux state, you have to make sure that your test is wrapping the application in a provider. So for the app.js components, we are if you go back to the app.js, you'll find out that we actually made use of the Redux at some point, and that is the reason why we'll be having it wrapped up in the provider. So we have this test passing, but if you scroll up, I'm just going to take this up a bit and scroll up, you'll find out that there is an error message which you shouldn't ignore. Try not to ignore any error message that you see in your terminal. So the error message says, warning, an update to app inside the test was not wrapped in art. And then if you scroll down, you'll see that it says when testing, code that causes React state updates should be wrapped into art. And you scroll down further, you will see the set is loading state to be false. What this means is that, remember I mentioned that our application has a loading spinner. So what this error message is telling us is that when the loading spinner is being taken off the UI, we are supposed to account for that transition between taking the loading spinner off and showing the user what we want the user to see. So because we did not account for this in our test, we are having an error. Now you're going to be having this error whenever you are testing an app or a component that has some form of state update or state changes. So I'm just going to show you a very quick way to solve this, not just a quick way, but actually the right way to fix this problem. So what we'll do is to copy the error message, go back to the browser, and here we're just going to type RTL for React Testing Library, and we're going to say error, and we're going to paste the error message. Now here we have Stack Overflow. I've done this before, so I'm not going to waste time going into different links. I'm just going to scroll down to the solution that I found most useful and most relevant, which is the one by Kent C. Dot. The title says fix the not wrapped in art warning. And if you scroll down, you're going to see some videos which you can take your time to watch. And here it talks about the dreaded art warning. I actually like that word dreaded because that warning showed me shege. If you don't know what shege means hell. So that particular error message showed me hell. So I'm going to scroll down to the solutions provided. I think there are 2 or 3 solutions. The first one talks about using the wait for element to be removed. Now this is relevant if you have an element that needs to be unmounted when some state in your component changes, like the loading spinner I talked about. And because this is very close to the solution we are trying to solve, I'm just going to copy this line of code. Trust me, I've read this before, so don't do this where you just copy something without reading through to understand what the author is saying. So because I've read through this, I know what I am looking for already, and that is why I'm just copying it straight up. For you, take your time to go through it from the beginning of the document. So I'm going to stop the test from running for a while we try to fix that bug. Now I'm going to come back to the test file. Towards the end of the test case, I'm going to paste this, then I'll make this function to be asynchronous, and I'm going to import the wait for element to be removed method from React testing library. I'm also going to import screen from React testing library. So the element that we want to wait for it to be removed is not this particular one which we copied, rather it is the loading spinner. So I'm going to go back into my app.jss. I'll open it by the side here on the right. So what we want to do is to find a way to identify the loading spinner on our application. And here is where the query methods I talked about earlier will come to play. One of them is this queryBy test. But you use queryBy test when you are trying to identify an element by its test content. Now the loading spinner we have, we can get it from here by tracing this, just using the command and double click. So here we have our loading spinner. How do we identify this loading spinner? To start, we are going to go back to the React Testing Library official documentation and find out how elements or components are being queried. So here in React Testing Library website, we go to the Core API section, we go to About Queries, and when we scroll down, please take your time to also read this like I said earlier. When we scroll down, we will see that there are different types of queries. There is a getBy queries. Actually, they are grouped into single element queries and multiple element queries. Now we have the getBy query, which is used to get a particular element. We also have the getAllBy, which is used to get multiple elements. Each of these queries have their best use cases. And I'm also going to scroll down to this section that talks about priority, because it's very important for you to know the best way to query your component. At the top of the priority list, we have queries accessible to everyone, which is the getBy role, getBy label test, getBy placeholder test, getBy display value. Then we have the semantic queries on the second place. Then we have the test ID on the second place. So you're just going to look at these queries and find out if there's anyone you can use on the loading spinner. Coming back to the loading spinner, we'll find out that the loading spinner is just a div that the class name is loading spinner. That's all we have here. We do not have a test content in it. We do not have a placeholder because it's not an input element. So what we can do is to use test IDs, which is like the last resort for you. And it's actually fine, just that is the last thing on the priority list. We'll be making use of the other ones very soon by the time we start testing other components of the application. Now, to use the getBy test ID, what you have to do is to ensure that the element or component you want to test has a particular attribute called data test ID. So we're going to be adding it here, data-test ID, call it loading spinner, and we are going to copy the test ID. We'll come back to the test file and change this to queryBy test ID, and then we paste what we copied into the bracket. Oh, don't forget to put your quotes because it's a string. So let's go back to the terminal and run the test again. Now the test is failing. Let's see why is it failing. So it's actually an error message which says use routes may be only used in the context of a router component. Okay, so that's because our application component has a lot of routings in it. It doesn't have to be a lot, so long as there's routing in it. So going back here, we can see that there are lots of routings in our application. So whenever you have route in your application, for instance, you are using navigation in your application to move from one page to another or from one component to another, you have to ensure that you wrap your component in a router wrapper or component. So we are going to be doing something similar to what we have in our index.js. So we just go back to index.js, and we are going to be copying the same browser router we used here, and we'll be pasting it here. So just import browser router. You don't need to do as router, so you can just leave it like this, or you can also leave it as router. And then you come down here and wrap this application in the router component. Now let's see our test cases if they pass, or if it passed, because we have one test case. So yes, our test is now passing. So I think we've done pretty well for the main app application or the main app component. We'll be going next into the login component. Like I said, we are going to be testing the login page, and I will use the opportunity to show you the first thing that you write when you create a test file. And I'm going to close all the folders. Then we go to source, we go to the screens, and we go to the login screen. So it's important for you to know that when you're writing your test, it's good to place your test file next to the file of the component that you want to test. And that is why we had our test file for the app just beside the app or next to the app.js. Same thing will apply for any component or any page or any screen that you'll be testing. So you go into the folder where you have the component or the page, and whatever name you give to the component is best to also give the test file the same name, but of course the extension will be different. So we'll come to the login screen and then we'll create a new file. We'll name it index.test.js. So I'm going to open the index.js, which is the main file. I'm going to open it on the right hand side while we have the test file on the left hand side. I'll be closing some of the files that I no longer need for now. We have a clean slate here. The first thing that I want to do is to import the components we'll be testing. So we'll say import login from, so we'll just say index, which is the name of the file that contains the login component that we have on the right here. You can actually call it login screen. So I'm just going to copy this, rename the import as login screen. Then I'll be introducing you to the structure of your test file. Your test file will usually have a describe block, and it will have a test block. So the describe block is what we use to group different test block or test cases. Now a test case is like we had in the app.test.js file. This is a test case. So is that you use test or you use it, you achieve the same result. When you have a group of test cases that are being applied on the same component or for the same purpose, then it's important to group them into a describe block. So You come back here and say the describe block is what you use to group different test cases. Then the test block is what you use to write individual test cases. The next thing we will be writing is the different things that we want to test on the login screen. So I'm just going to use a multi-line comment here. Going to the component on the right hand side, the first thing we have here is an image, which is the company logo. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to run this application so that we see it live on the browser. This is the page that we want to test. So we want to test for the company logo, which in this case is Netflix. Then we want to test to see that the user is seeing the sign in button. We want to be sure that the user is seeing this input element and also the get started button. So we'll start with a describe block. From the description, we can see that the describe function takes into argument the name of the name of the describe block and a callback function. So we'll name it login screen, and we'll add a callback function that will contain all the test cases. So let's write the first test case for this application. Also, the test method takes in a name and a callback function. So we'll name this something very descriptive. So we'll say we are testing that the company logo is rendered. So we'll say renders company logo. And next we'll have a callback function. Inside the callback function, we are going to render the login screen. So we use render method, and then we'll add the login component. So we need to import the render component. We also need to change this to login screen. The render component will be coming from React testing library, like we have in the previous test that we wrote. So we'll just copy this line, add it at the top here. We're going to remove this, wait for element to be removed because we don't need it at the moment, but we'll leave the screen. We'll be using it very soon. Now that we have the login screen rendered on our testing environment, the next thing we want to do is to start using our assertions. Assertions are how you define what you expect to see on your applications, and it usually starts with the expect keyword and then takes what you are expecting in a bracket, and after that it takes what you want the thing you expect to do. So you say you want it to be truthy. You can get this from Jest by just going back to the Jest link I shared earlier. What does to be truthy do? To be truthy just checks that something exists, is true, and it is not false. So inside the expect method, we are going to specify what we expect to see, and what we expect to see in this case is the company logo. The next question is, how do we pick the company logo from the screen we just rendered? And that is where we are going to go back to the React testing library, to the queries page, and based on this priority list, we are going to check our component or element and figure out how can we identify the element. So we'll come back to the login page. We have the element which holds the company logo here as image element, and we already have a data test ID. Like I mentioned before, this is strictly for testing, so you already know that I added this here because of the test we want to run. So we are going to pick this test ID, and we'll use screen dot getBy test ID, and we pass in the test ID as a string. So we'll go back to the terminal and run our test. So we see that we have two test cases that are now passing. Now, to understand what we are seeing in the terminal, the first thing is the path of the first test that we have, which is the login screen. The second one is for the second test file. Now just is telling us that we have two test suites, which just means we have two test files, and combined we have two test cases. If you want more detailed information about any particular test file, all you have to do is run that single test, and I'll show you how to do it. Just copy the path you have here, stop the test, and then do npm run test again, give a space and paste the file path. So it's going to run just that particular file, and you will see the description and the test description as well. So that is what we have here. We have the login screen, which is what we have in the describe block, and then we have the description of the test case, which says renders company logo. Now going back to this particular assertion on line 18, it's okay to say to be true to you, but to have our test cases or our test assertions being relevant to what we are actually doing, rather than saying to be true to you, we are going to change this to be in the document, because we want to be sure that this particular element is in our document. So say to be in the document. So this is still passing and we are good to go. The next thing we want to do is to test the other elements. So we'll just copy this particular test case because we're going to be doing something very similar. And I'll stop this test from rerunning for now. In our new test case, we can see it's already throwing an error saying that test title is used multiple times in the same describe block. So we are going to change this because we want to test for something else. We want to test that it renders the sign in button. Copy this. And now let's go to the component file and see how the sign in button is being rendered. So we have a button, we have a test content, but going back to the priority list we have on React testing library, we see that the first thing on the priority list is actually getBy role. Now in HTML, the button element has a role of button, which could have been like this, role button. This is how it is by default. The element button has an implicit role of button. Defining this explicitly is redundant and should be avoided. So I just did this to show you that this button has a role. So we're going to take this out. Bearing in mind that the button element has a role called button. We can now rejoice because we are about to make the most of the priority list. So we'll just copy this getBy role, change this getBy test ID to getBy role, and we'll be changing this to button. And then we'll run the test again. So the test failed because it says found multiple elements with the role button. Here are the matching elements. And React testing library has a beautiful way of showing you actually what component is rendered. So it has the sign in button and it also has the get started button, but we just want the sign in button. So there are two ways to actually do this. Knowing fully well that we have two buttons returned in an array, you can come here and change this to get all by button, get all by row, and then you pick the first element that is returned. And our test pass. But now I do not want you to do this because a lot of things can change in your UI and you don't want to be dependent on just saying, I want to check for the first button that is returned. So this is not a good way to handle this problem. The best way to handle it is to specify the content of the button that you are trying to check for. So undo this and we pass in a second argument to the getBy role method. So put a comma and we say the name should be signing. This failed because what we have here is signing in letter case. To fix this, we'll just convert this to regular expression or make it exactly what it is. So I'll choose the regular expression just to show you how it is done. And then we'll add I to say we don't want it to be case sensitive. Now we see that the test is passing and we are sure that we are getting the exact button we want to get. I'm going to pause this tutorial here and write the test for the other element and I'll walk you through it after that. I'm back, and if you notice, I had to move all the assertions into one test case or test block, and the reason why I did that is because I didn't want to keep rendering the login screen just to test tiny things like test content and the type of button that is being displayed on the component. So here our test is still passing. We'll change this from render company logo to renders login screen. So as far as visibility is concerned, I think we are done with testing our application or our component. Please also note that it's not just to be in the document that we have as an assertion method. You can also check for visibility by saying to be visible. Sorry, I'm just going to change this to be visible. Now what this checks for is to be sure that this particular component is not just inside the document, but it is also visible to your user. So if, for instance, you have an opacity of 0 attached to your company logo, which means that the users will not be able to see the logo, this particular test case or this particular assertion is going to fail. I'll be showing you other assertion methods as we go deeper into this tutorial. Moving on, we'll be going to the page that has the email and passwords by clicking on the sign in button here, and we are going to be testing for what the user sees or what is in the document when this particular page or when this particular component is rendered. We'll open the sidebar and go to the sign up screen, which is the screen responsible for that particular component. And like we did for the login screen, we're going to be creating a new file here and we'll just call it index.test.js. I'm going to move the test file to the left hand side and open the sign up screen on the right hand side. We're going to close this sidebar. We'll be doing something similar to what we did for the login page. So first we want to import the components. So say sign up screen, and we'll just go back to the file we had before and copy this as well. Then we are going to have our describe block, which would say sign up screen. Then we'll have our callback function, and we'll have our first test case. We'll say renders sign up screen. Then we would have our callback function. And now we are going to use the render method to render the sign up screen. And the first thing we want to pick up is this sign-in test here. Notice that there are actually two sign-in tests, one at the top and one on the sign-in button. We're going to figure out how to pick each of them, or the both of them, if you want to test that they are two. So if you want to test that they are two, all you have to do is just come here and say expert screen.getBy test, and you pass in the test. Let's use regular expression this time. And then we say dot length because this is going to return an array for us. So we say dot length, and then we say dot to be. Now look at this, there are so many assertion methods we can use, a lot of them, which of course we are not going to cover everything. We're not going to cover everything in this tutorial, but we'll cover as much as possible. So we'll say to be 2. Now let's run the test and see. This time around we are going to be running the sign up screen. So say sign up. So let's see what we have here. It says that the test is failing. Why is it failing? The error message says use navigate may be used only in the context of a router component. So like I mentioned earlier, whenever you have any form of routing in your component, you have to wrap it with a router. And the reason why we are seeing this error is because we actually have a navigation here. So not just routing components, if you have navigation, any form of navigation, then ensure you wrap your component. Like we did for the app component, we'll just come up here and say import. We're going to put this in a string, React Redux, and what we're importing is the browser router. Sorry, not React Redux, is React Router DOM. React Router DOM, and we are importing browser router. And we're going to wrap this in a router component. Now let's see what happens in the test. The test is failing. Why is it failing? It says unable to find an element with the alt test sign in. Oh, we're actually not using alt test, we're using getBy test, not alt test. And yes, our test is passing because we actually have two components or two elements that has the sign-in test in it, which is this one and this one. So if you are interested in testing just one of them, what you can do is to add the data test ID or find any other thing that is unique to that particular element and use it to test the element. So let's go back to this component and let's see. We have the sign in as H1. We also have the sign in as a button. So we can use the getBy rule that we used earlier to pick up the button. We can also give this one a data ID. Just note that you can be very flexible with your testing, but ensure that you're testing exactly what your user is going to experience in your application. So for us to test for this button, we are going to be using the button rule. Actually, I'll just come here and copy what we have here. And add it. And our test is still passing. Next, we want to check for the input elements, the email and the password input elements. And we can do this by using the placeholder test we have here, since we do not have a label test. Going back to React testing library queries, you can see that this documentation says it's better to use getBy label test instead of getBy placeholder test. But in a case where you don't have labels for your form input elements, you can go ahead and use the placeholder test. So let's write the next assertion. Now you will notice that I've added more assertions to this particular test case. Feel free to place individual assertions in individual test cases or test blocks, whatever works for you, it's fine. Let me explain what is going on here. We still have a sign-in test, which we've actually assigned to a variable. We still have the assertion down here. Then we have the sign-in button, we have the email input element, this input element here, and we are picking it up by the placeholder test, which is email. Then we have the password, we are picking it up by the placeholder. Then we have an error alert. The error alert is this particular one. What happens when you enter an invalid input element? This is the error alert message. It says please enter a valid email address. We do not want the user to see this when they visit this page for the first time or when the page renders. So we will be picking it up and saying that we do not want it to be on the or in the document. And we're using rule because we have already assigned it a rule, which you can see here on line 70. So we'll be using the rule alert. And the reason why we are using queryBy rule is because if we use if we use getBy rule, it's going to throw an error because the element is actually not there, and getBy throws an error. Going back to the React library documentation, you see it up here. It says getBy returns a matching node for the query and throws a descriptive error if no elements match or if more than one element is found. Now, we do not want it to throw an error if no elements matches, because that is actually what we want to check, that no element matches. So rather than using getBy, we are using the queryBy, which returns the matching node for a query and return null if no element matches. So we do not want an error, we just want to be sure that it is not there. That is why we're using the queryBy, and then we add row, which is what we want to query by. That is how we have the queryBy row alert. And down here we are saying that we are expecting the error alert to be null. We're expecting it to return null. And the next thing we want to check is queryBy test. Please enter a valid email address. This is the content of the error message, and it can either be this or it can be this for password. The first one is for email, the second one is for password. We just want to be sure that these two things are not on the component once it renders. And there is also a third one which says wrong email or password. So these three, we are using the query to check for them. And so we'll run our test again to see what we have here. The test is failing, and the reason why it is failing is that it says expected receive to be null, and it says that you received an error alert of row alert, and which is on line 26. So that means that our error alert is actually showing up. We are going to figure out why it is so and how to fix it. Now, the reason why we have the error alert there is because of the way we are rendering it in the component itself. We are rendering it with a paragraph element, and we are saying that if the form error exists, then we want to add the form error, else we return an empty string. Now, this obviously is not the best way to handle this situation, because what we are saying is that we want that particular element to always be on the application, but in actual sense we only want it to be in the application or in our document when there's an actual error. So we're going to be writing how this is rendered. So we'll change this to this, and our test is going to pass. Yes, our test is passing. So in that case, the error component is only rendered when there is an actual error, so it is not occupying space unnecessarily. So to end the first part of this tutorial, we are going to be adding an extra test case that tests for when the user actually enters an email address here before going to the sign up screen. So the user enters an email address and clicks on get started. We want to be sure that the email address is being displayed to the user. And what happens is, going back to the component, we notice that this component takes a prop called email address or email. And this prop, if it exists, we want to have it here in our email input element. So the default value here is email. We're going to be testing that the email address is visible to the user when this happens. Here is the second test case, and we say that we are testing for automatically filling in the email address from the login page. And that is when we render this component with a prop, which is an email address, and we just say example at mail.com. So we'll pick up the email input, and we want to check that the email input has a value of example at mail.com. We can either do it this way or this way. So the second way of doing it is just to check that the email input has a default value of this. And that is because in the element itself, we're having a default value that we assign the email to. So we are saying, so notice this method says to have value, And in the description, it says check whether the given form element has the specified value. So I'm just going to leave 1, which is very okay. And our tests will still pass. So let's just close this and run the test again. And as you can see, all the test cases we have so far are passing. Thank you so much for staying with me to the end of this tutorial. I hope to see you in the second one, where we go deeper into testing the functionality of our React components. Take care of yourself and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye!